Welcome to Secrets in Slumber. Tonight, we drift with the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, far out on the Atlantic, where steel meets the sea and silence carries secrets. In this quiet expanse, routines unfold with perfect precision, yet somewhere between the radar sweeps and the stars, the unknown is waiting. Settle in, let the waves carry you, and join us as we step aboard the Watch. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endless and unbroken, a vast mirror of dark waters touched only by the rhythm of its waves. Out here, hundreds of miles from any shore, silence was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something greater, the eternal hum of the sea, the low groan of steel hulls, and the faint whisper of wind moving across decks. It was night, and the world of land and cities seemed impossibly far away. Only the ocean, the sky, and the steady presence of the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group remained. The USS Gerald Ford itself, the largest carrier ever built, moved through the waters with quiet authority. Its sheer mass seemed to hush the sea around it, and yet within its vast interior, life carried on in ordered rhythm. Lights glowed faintly in portholes. On the flight deck, rows of aircraft sat in silence, their sleek outlines catching hints of moonlight. Beneath the surface, thousands of sailors and officers rotated through watches, tending to duties that kept the ship alive. Some stood at radar consoles, their eyes tracing the sweep of green lines across dark screens. Others walked the wide corridors, footsteps soft against the steel. It was a living city at sea, yet it breathed in a pace that was slower, more patient than the world beyond the horizon. Around the carrier, the strike group kept station. Destroyers traced arcs of protection, their decks bristling with sensors and weapons that appeared asleep but were never truly at rest. Submarines lurked unseen, keeping to the shadowed depths. Together they formed a moving fortress, a perfect blend of precision and vigilance, and in that formation, the sailors trusted that nothing could approach without being known. The Atlantic was wide, yes, but nothing passed unmeasured. At least, that was the belief. Above, stars burned in their silent patterns. Constellations that sailors had relied on for centuries shone brightly against the black canvas. The night sky carried with it a serenity that masked its deeper mysteries. Satellites drifted, aircraft passed at distant altitudes, and sometimes streaks of light, meteors, reminded those awake that Earth was not alone in the great expanse. But those were known things, catalogued and understood. It was the unknown that lingered quietly, waiting for its moment. On nights like this, when the ship cut a steady path through calm seas, men and women at their stations sometimes let their thoughts drift. They thought of home, of letters waiting unread, of families asleep beneath roofs far away. They thought of the ocean's immensity, of how small even a carrier seemed against the scale of the planet. And sometimes, though they seldom spoke of it, they thought of the skies that had delivered storms and stars in equal measure, and which, in whispers of rumor, had carried things stranger still. For decades, navies had shared quiet stories of radar echoes that appeared without explanation, of pilots who saw objects accelerate beyond the limits of known machines, of lights that hovered over the sea before slipping silently beneath the waves. These were not tales told in the open. They were traded in hushed voices, remembered in margins of logbooks, carried like burdens more than adventures. Outwardly, the official record remained clean, precise, untroubled. But within the rhythm of watches, between the sound of footsteps and the sweep of radar arms, questions lingered. Tonight, As the Gerald Ford sailed under the calm gaze of the stars, those questions would return. The sea and the sky had always hidden their secrets well, yet sometimes, briefly, they allowed glimpses, flashes of light, impossible maneuvers, presences that defied the neat categories of radar and report. And when those moments came, they left behind a quiet weight, a sense that humanity was not the only watcher in the night. So the carrier group sailed on, engines thrumming, decks gleaming faintly beneath the moon. The sailors kept their routines, the officers maintained their orders, and the ocean whispered against steel. But beyond the horizon, in the vast darkness of sky and sea, something waited, something that would not remain silent for long. Chapter 1. The Watch Begins. The USS Gerald R. Ford was not a ship that slept. Though night pressed heavy over the Atlantic, and the surface of the sea rolled in calm, patient swells, the carrier breathed with a steady rhythm all its own. Inside its hull, thousands of sailors kept to their duties, each part of a vast choreography that made the ship less a vessel and more a floating city. In the Combat Information Center, the glow of screens painted faces in shifting greens and blues. Radar operators leaned forward in their chairs, headphones snug over their ears, their eyes following the slow sweep of luminous arms across digital seas. The sound was subtle, almost hypnotic. The quiet click of keys, the hum of consoles, the faint vibration of machinery embedded deep within the ship. Outside, waves might be breaking endlessly against steel, but here the world was defined by signals and echoes, by points of light that appeared, vanished, and returned again. Elsewhere on the flight deck above, silence was different. Jets sat in ordered rows, their canopies covered, their wings folded like resting birds. The deck stretched into darkness, watched over by sailors in reflective vests who walked with measured steps, flashlights flickering across the sea of parked aircraft. Beyond the carrier's edge, the horizon was invisible, a black wall of night, sky melting seamlessly into water. Only the faint spray of stars broke the vastness, constellations sailors had known for centuries, keeping quiet company with modern technology. Below deck, the rhythm was more human. The mess hall buzzed softly with late-night meals. Trays clinked against metal. Voices murmured in low conversation, laughter rising occasionally before fading back into the hush. In the berthing compartments, sailors lay in narrow racks, some already asleep, others reading by the glow of small lights, the ship's steady vibration beneath them as familiar as breath. Even sleep aboard the Gerald Ford was not silent. It was laced with the constant presence of machinery, engines, and the heartbeat of a vessel always in motion. On the bridge, officers kept their watch. Their voices were calm, clipped, part of a language of discipline and order, bearing, speed, wind direction. The carrier sailed at a steady pace, flanked by destroyers and supply ships that maintained formation in the darkness. To the casual eye, the ocean was empty, but the strike group moved like a single organism, each ship tied invisibly to the other by radio, radar, and years of practiced coordination. For many on duty, the hours passed in a familiar blur. Watches were measured in increments, in tasks repeated again and again, updating logs, checking instruments, scanning the horizon. There was comfort in the routine, comfort in the knowledge that every man and woman aboard trusted the system, trusted the layers of vigilance built into every corner of the ship. The Atlantic could be vast and silent, but aboard the Gerald Ford, silence was never empty. It was filled with the hum of readiness, and yet beneath that rhythm, there was always the quiet possibility of interruption. Out here, far from land, the ocean carried whispers of sudden storms, of unexpected signals, of things appearing at the edge of instruments only to slip away again. Sailors knew the stories, even if they did not speak of them often. Stories of nights when the radar caught shapes that should not have been there, of skies that revealed lights no aircraft could explain. For now, those remained only stories. The watch continued, calm and steady, unbroken, but the sea and sky are vast, and sometimes, within their silence, the first anomalies stir. The Gerald R. Ford was more than a warship. It was a world of its own, stretching over 1,000 feet from bow to stern, a floating runway and fortress that carried the presence of a city across the sea. To walk its decks was to feel both small and sheltered, for the scale of the carrier was so vast that even the endless Atlantic seemed less imposing when seen from its steel heights. On the flight deck, the largest of its kind ever constructed, rows of aircraft waited in silence. Fell A-8 Super Hornets, E-2 Dead Hawkeyes, and stealthy F-35Cs stood poised like guardians at rest, their wings folded with precise symmetry. During the day, this deck would roar with activity, engines igniting, steam catapults launching jets into the air with thunderous force. But at night, the deck belonged to the wind and the stars. Sailors moved with quiet discipline, securing gear, checking tie-down chains, ensuring that every detail was correct. Their footsteps were faint against the wide black expanse, their movements guided by training that left no room for hesitation. The flight deck stretched so far that walking from one end to the other felt like crossing a small town street, lined not with houses, but with sleeping machines. Beneath the deck, the atmosphere changed. Here, the ship's interior opened into a labyrinth of passageways, compartments, and chambers. Pipes ran overhead like arteries, painted in colors that marked their function: steam, air, water, fuel. Narrow ladders led up and down between levels, connecting mess halls, offices, workshops, and living spaces. For new sailors, the Gerald Ford's interior could feel disorienting, a maze of identical corridors and hatches. But with time, everyone learned its patterns, the subtle differences in sound, smell, and vibration that told them where they were. In the hangar bay, one of the largest enclosed spaces aboard, aircraft rested on polished decks beneath towering overhead cranes. The bay echoed faintly with the metallic sounds of tools and footsteps. Even at night, work continued here. Maintenance crews adjusting panels, inspecting engines, preparing for the next day's sorties. The smell of oil and hydraulic fluid hung in the air, mixed with the faint salt carried in from the sea. The hangar was lit with a steady glow, a contrast to the dim passageways elsewhere. For sailors working here, time blurred. There was no night or day, only shifts, only tasks. Further down, in the reactor spaces and engineering compartments, the rhythm deepened into something elemental. Few aboard ever saw the heart of the carrier, but all felt its presence. The ship's twin reactors hummed with quiet power, driving turbines that propelled the vessel across the ocean with steady determination. Engineers moved through these spaces with careful precision, monitoring gauges, adjusting valves, listening for the slightest change in pitch or pressure. Down here, the sea was distant, unseen, replaced by the eternal heartbeat of machinery. And then there was life itself, carried in the small rituals of sailors far from home. In the mess decks, meals were served around the clock, trays clinked, voices murmured, laughter rose and fell in bursts before quieting again. On off hours, Sailors played cards, wrote letters, or watched movies on small screens, their laughter and conversations filling corners of steel rooms that otherwise might feel too confining. In berthing compartments, narrow racks stacked 3 high lined the walls, curtains drawn for privacy. Some slept soundly, rocked gently by the ocean's movement. Others lay awake, staring at the faint glow of overhead lights, their thoughts drifting as steadily as the ship itself. Everywhere the ship's scale made itself felt. The Gerald Ford was vast, yet contained. It offered both a sense of immensity and of enclosure. To serve aboard, it was to live within a world that moved as one, where the sea outside was infinite, but the steel within was constant, unyielding, protective. For those who walked its decks, the rhythm of life became second nature. Watches changed, meals came and went, days blurred into weeks. The ocean stretched forever, but the carrier was always home. And yet within this carefully ordered world, something subtle was stirring. The routines remained, the machinery ran smoothly, and the sailors carried on. But at the edges of screens, in the faintest corners of the watch, anomalies began to flicker. Not yet noticed, not yet understood, just small blips, the kind that vanish almost before they are seen. The Combat Information Center was quiet, a cave of dim light and softly glowing screens. The air was cool, recycled, touched by the faint scent of electronics that never truly slept. Here, the outside world was reduced to numbers, echoes, and symbols. The sea was not rolling waves, but shifting green sweeps across dark monitors. The sky was not stars and wind, but arcs and traces that revealed what could not be seen with the naked eye. Petty Officer Reyes sat at his console, headphones snug over his ears, his gaze steady on the luminous sweep of the radar. The rhythm was hypnotic, the lines circling, the soft blip of surface contacts that appeared, held their place, and moved predictably with each pass. He knew the destroyers in formation, the supply ships, even the faint ghost of the submarine moving far below the surface. Every mark had a reason, every track a name, every movement logged and checked against the group's tight formation. But tonight, something unusual stirred. It began faintly, a solitary return, small and sharp, appearing at the edge of the radar's reach. It flashed once, then disappeared. Reyes frowned, adjusted his gain, recalibrated his scope. Nothing. The sweep passed again, clear. He leaned back slightly, chalking it up to clutter. Atmospheric distortion, perhaps, or a false return caused by distant weather. Such things happened. Minutes later, it returned. A blip, this time nearer, holding for 3 sweeps before vanishing again. Reyes checked his log, noted it quietly. The contact had no identification, no transponder, no correlation with any known aircraft in the region. It was fast, unnervingly so, and then it was gone. He pressed his lips together and tapped his pencil against the edge of the console, hesitating before writing the word, intermittent in the margin of his log. Across the room, another operator called out softly, "Reyes, you seeing this?" On her screen, Petty Officer Sullivan had caught a similar return, different bearing, different altitude. Just as quickly, it faded. The two exchanged a look, the kind that carried both curiosity and caution. Neither wanted to call attention to something that might vanish as quickly as it appeared. False contacts were common, after all. The ocean and atmosphere had their quirks. Still, Sullivan marked her log. Reyes did the same. The officer of the watch approached, hands clasped behind his back, eyes sweeping across the consoles. He moved quietly, listening, observing. Ray's straightened slightly, but said nothing. The officer paused, glanced at the screens, and then at the operators. "Weather echoes?" he asked softly. Ray's hesitated, then nodded. "Most likely, sir." The officer gave a slight nod in return, satisfied, and moved on. The logs remained, but no alarm was raised. For the next hour, the watch continued. Routine reports filled the silence. Bearings checked, surface tracks confirmed, aircraft formations noted. Yet now and then, like a whisper at the edge of hearing, a new blip appeared, sometimes near, sometimes far, always without warning, always gone before it could be fixed, long enough to classify. Operators logged them with neat handwriting, noting times, bearings, altitudes. The pages began to fill with scattered notations that formed no clear pattern, no steady track to chase. Above deck, on the bridge, the horizon was empty. Lookouts scanned the night with binoculars, reporting only the soft gleam of starlight against water. The ocean stretched featureless, the sky serene, nothing unusual. The Gerald Ford sailed steadily forward, destroyers maintaining their stations, the sea calm beneath them. From that vantage, the night seemed perfectly ordinary, but deep within the carrier, where screens glowed and operators listened for the faintest echo, the sense of unease grew, not panic, not even alarm, just a subtle awareness that the ocean and sky were not as empty as they appeared. Something was moving, swift and fleeting, beyond the reach of easy explanation. By the time the watch turned over, the anomalies had faded. The new shift received only a brief note, intermittent contacts, likely clutter. The words were spoken without emphasis, as though they were of little importance. Yet the sailors who had seen the strange blips lingered a little longer at their consoles before leaving, glancing back as if expecting something more to appear. For now, the Gerald Ford's routines held steady, but the sea had spoken, faintly, briefly, and though it left no trace, its whisper remained. Chapter 2. Objects on the Horizon. The Atlantic dusk came slowly, washing the horizon in fading layers of gold and violet before surrendering to deepening blue. On the flight deck of the Gerald R. Ford, preparations for the evening exercise unfolded with calm precision. Aircraft handlers moved in deliberate patterns, their reflective vests catching the last light of the sun. The deck, so silent earlier, now carried a subdued energy, not the roar of launches, but the steady rhythm of readiness. Inside the ready room, pilots sat in rows, helmets resting on their knees, eyes following the calm voice of the briefing officer. The exercise itself was routine, a set of training sorties, simulated intercepts, and aerial refueling practice. Yet even routine aboard a carrier carried weight. Every checklist mattered. Every signal was part of a chain that stretched from the lowest deckhand to the command center on the bridge. The pilots listened with a mixture of focus and ease, their confidence honed by repetition. For them, the air was both workplace and home, its dangers acknowledged but seldom dwelled upon. Lieutenant Commander Harris leaned back slightly in his chair, arms crossed, his gaze steady on the map displayed at the front of the room. The lines of the exercise were simple, clear. Launch at 1930, patrol in pairs, intercept mock targets relayed through data link, return by 2100. Nothing unusual. He exchanged a glance with his wingman, a quiet nod that said everything words did not need to. They had flown this kind of drill countless times. Still, the weight of the sky above the Atlantic was never entirely predictable. On the bridge, the atmosphere mirrored the flight deck's discipline. Officers in crisp uniforms monitored instruments, updated logs, and kept their eyes on the horizon. The sea stretched flat and calm, broken only by the gentle churn of the strike group's formation. The destroyers flanking the carrier moved like shadows against the dimming horizon, their running lights faint but precise. Communications flowed steadily, clipped phrases crossing radio channels and internal circuits. Bearings checked, wind speed noted, launch conditions confirmed. The captain stood at the center, hands clasped loosely behind his back, his gaze sweeping from the bridge windows to the screens before him. To command a carrier was to balance calm authority with constant awareness. Every decision rippled outward across thousands of lives. Every order carried weight. Yet his voice, when he spoke, was measured, almost quiet. Maintain speed. Continue preparations for flight ops. Around him, the crew responded with crisp acknowledgments, their movements steady and sure. As the sun dipped lower, the first hints of night settled across the sea. Stars began to emerge, faint at first, then brighter as the sky deepened. Sailors on deck paused in their tasks to glance upward, as if reassured by the familiar constellations. For centuries, men at sea had looked to these same stars for guidance. Now, technology carried the burden of navigation, yet the sight of them still stirred something quiet and ancient. Below deck, in the Combat Information Center, the radar sweeps continued. The earlier anomalies had faded, replaced once more by the predictable order of the strike group's movements. Operators spoke softly, updating logs, cross-checking bearings. The sense of routine returned, and yet, here and there, eyes lingered a little longer on the screens, remembering the fleeting blips that had danced on their edges hours before. No alarm had been raised, but memory had a way of clinging. By the time the flight deck lights came alive, casting their pale glow across rows of aircraft, the carrier was ready. The air was cooler now, the sea darker, the horizon nearly invisible. Pilots moved with quiet confidence, strapping into cockpits, running through pre-flight checks, their voices calm over intercom circuits. Launch crews signaled with practiced precision, their gestures sharp and clear even in the half-light. Engines began to whine, then roar, vibrations rolling across the deck and into the steel of the ship itself. It was the same routine as countless evenings before, yet as dusk deepened into night, the ocean carried its own secrets, waiting just beyond the horizon, and before long, those secrets would begin to show themselves. The horizon had nearly vanished when the first glint appeared. From the flight deck, it was nothing more than a faint shimmer at the edge of vision, the kind of reflection sailors often dismissed as sunlight bending across the last wisps of cloud. Yet the sun had already slipped beneath the Atlantic, and the sky was too dark for light to play such tricks. A young aviation boatswain's mate was the first to notice. He paused in his work, a length of chain slack in his hands, and squinted toward the west. For a moment he thought it was a star, unusually bright, but then it moved, not with the slow, predictable arc of a planet rising, nor the straight path of an aircraft. It shifted abruptly, like a gleam off polished metal, vanishing, then reappearing farther along the horizon. He said nothing at first, only watched, his pulse quickening in quiet contrast to the calm around him. On the bridge, binoculars swept across the horizon as routine procedure. A junior officer brought the lenses up to his eyes and froze. Against the fading glow, a pinpoint of light hovered, steady at first, then sliding sideways against the wind. It held no navigation lights, no strobes, no signature that marked it as one of their own. He lowered the glasses, blinked, and raised them again. Still there, he cleared his throat softly, careful to keep his voice even. "Captain, I've got something at bearing 270. Unidentified light, altitude unknown." The captain moved forward, calm as always, and took the binoculars himself. For long moments he said nothing. The bridge was silent, but for the soft hum of instruments and the shuffle of sailors at their posts. At last, the captain lowered the lenses and handed them back. "Keep watch. Log the sighting." His tone was flat, neither alarmed nor dismissive. It was the voice of a man who had seen strange things before and knew better than to leap to conclusions. Down on the deck, pilots strapped into their cockpits were catching glimpses of it too. Through visors and canopy glass, some noticed a flicker at the corner of their eyes, something too sharp, too deliberate to be mistaken for a distant star. One pilot, already running through his pre-flight checks, tapped his helmet mic. "Deck, this is Eagle 2. You seeing that light off our 9 o'clock?" The response was clipped, professional. "Eagle 2, we have it logged. Maintain pre-flight." There was no tremor of uncertainty in the voice, but in the background, hands moved faster, logs filled with new notes. On the Combat Information Center's radar screens, there was nothing. The sweep passed clean. No contact, no echo, only the ordered returns of the strike group and their support. Sullivan and Reyes exchanged another look, remembering the faint anomalies from hours earlier. Reyes marked a fresh note in his log. "Visual report, bearing 270. No radar return." The contrast was unsettling. To the eye, something was there. To the machines, the sky was empty. As the glint persisted, it began to shift, slowly at first, then in sharp bursts that defied wind or weather. It moved upward, paused, then slid laterally across the horizon. Each motion was smooth, deliberate, yet unlike the steady acceleration of known aircraft. Sailors on deck found themselves glancing toward it more often, hands moving through their tasks with practiced automation, while their eyes betrayed quiet unease. Minutes stretched. The glint brightened, dimmed, and then split. One point of light became two. The pair hovered close, then drifted apart, their movements too coordinated, too precise to be dismissed as chance. Still, no sound reached the carrier. The sea remained calm, the wind steady, the night unchanged, but for these two strange lights, now moving with purpose across the western sky, the captain's voice broke the silence on the bridge. "Continue preparations, no deviations." The order was routine, yet it carried an undertone the crew recognized. Stay steady, stay professional, no matter what unfolds beyond the rails of the ship. Logs were updated, binoculars remained fixed, and the hum of readiness continued. But beneath the discipline, something was shifting. The horizon had revealed its first secret. The Gerald Ford moved steadily on, her engines thrumming deep within the steel hull, but in scattered corners of the strike group, voices began to shift. What had started as a single glint at the horizon had grown into two, sometimes three, lights moving in ways that resisted simple explanation. And though official channels kept their tone clipped and steady, the conversations that followed carried an undercurrent of unease. On the bridge, the officer of the deck kept his voice calm, transmitting routine position reports, wind speeds, and headings. Yet between those crisp updates, another channel came alive with questions. A lookout reported the lights holding formation against the wind. Another noted how quickly they had slid across the horizon, as though distance meant nothing to them. Each report was logged with precision, but the voices behind them betrayed curiosity, even doubt. In the Combat Information Center, Sullivan adjusted her headset, listening carefully to crosstalk between the destroyers in formation. The USS Thomas Hudner had logged similar visual sightings, bright points above the horizon, no radar signature, no transponder. The USS Jason Dunham reported the same. Each ship had seen something, and each had checked their instruments twice, 3 times. Still nothing on radar. It was as if the sky itself had drawn a curtain, allowing the eyes to see but keeping the machines blind. Could be satellites. One voice suggested across the net. The words sounded rehearsed, as though borrowed from the safe drawer of explanations. But almost immediately another responded, not at that angle, not at that speed. Silence followed, the kind of silence that admits no easy answer. In the ready room below, pilots strapped into flight suits overheard fragments of the chatter. Most dismissed it with quiet jokes. Stars playing tricks, maybe the afterburn of long shifts. Yet even as they laughed, their eyes drifted toward the closed hatch, listening for confirmation. They knew how quickly a routine sortie could shift when the unknown entered the equation. On the mess decks, word spread more quickly. Sailors finishing their meals leaned closer across tables, voices hushed, trading what they had heard from lookouts and operators. Some described the lights as sharp and metallic, others as glowing spheres that pulsed faintly. No two accounts matched perfectly, yet all carried the same undertone. These were not ordinary aircraft. A young seaman murmured that his grandfather, once a Navy radioman, had spoken of similar lights during Cold War patrols, objects that appeared, lingered, and vanished without trace. The others listened, half skeptical, half unsettled, the story adding weight to their own uncertainty. The official line remained calm. Unidentified visual contacts, logged, but behind clipped phrasing, the questions grew. Why no radar return? Why no heat signature? Why now, in the middle of a routine patrol, so far from shipping lanes or civilian air routes? At 2040 hours, the carrier's air traffic controllers exchanged notes. One light had risen sharply, cutting across their sector in a way that suggested altitude changes impossible for known craft. They marked it carefully, updating their boards, though the blip itself never touched their screens. Still, the logs filled with timestamps, bearings, and descriptions that might one day be parsed for patterns. By then, pilots waiting on deck were strapping into their cockpits. Over their comms, voices mixed professionalism with curiosity. "You seeing what we're seeing topside?" one asked. The reply came steady, but clipped confirm visuals, awaiting orders. Beneath the surface of control, there was anticipation, the sense that tonight's exercise might become something else entirely. For now, the conversations remained contained, quiet threads across channels, whispers in mess halls, glances between sailors at their posts. Yet the mood aboard the Gerald Ford had shifted. The ocean was the same, the night calm, the strike group steady in formation. But the horizon no longer belonged only to the sea and the stars. It carried something new, something unexplained, silent and watching. Chapter 3. The Impossible Maneuvers. The hum of the Combat Information Center was steady, a rhythm of consoles, voices, and the faint mechanical sweep of instruments. To those inside, the world was measured in echoes and traces, each one catalogued, identified, and assigned a place within the ocean's vast theater. It was routine, until the night shifted. At first, it was subtle, almost unnoticed. A faint return bloomed at high altitude, far beyond the ordinary patrol lanes, lingering for only a heartbeat before vanishing. Reyes frowned at his scope, adjusted the filters, and leaned closer. Nothing. He tapped his pencil lightly against his logbook, considering whether to record it at all. But before the thought could fade, the blip reappeared, not where it had been, but lower, sharper, closer. Contact, Reyes murmured, half to himself, half to his supervisor. 30,000 feet, correction, now 20. The words hung in the air, disbelief threading through their calm delivery. Sullivan, at the next console, turned her head sharply, her own screen lit with the same anomaly. They watched in silence as the return plunged, dropping from near stratospheric heights to sea level in less than 2 seconds. No aircraft could move like that, not with such precision, not without tearing itself apart. The blip winked out just above the water, leaving only the steady line of the radar sweep behind it. Reyes, confirm altitude change, the supervisor said evenly, though his voice carried the faintest edge. Reyes checked, recalibrated, and nodded. Confirmed. 30 to sea level in one sweep. Sullivan added quietly, velocity off the chart, instantaneous. She marked her log, her handwriting precise, but her hand not entirely steady. Across the room, other operators leaned in. The destroyers flanking the Gerald Ford were reporting similar anomalies, their data feeds filling the shared network with jagged traces. Each ship confirmed abrupt accelerations, objects climbing, dropping and shifting laterally at impossible speeds. It was not one contact, but several, each appearing and vanishing as though the ocean itself were a stage for their movements. The officer of the watch approached, calm but intent. He studied the screens, listened to the murmured reports, and then asked the only question that mattered. Correlation. Reyes hesitated. Multiple vessels reporting. No heat, no IFF, all visuals negative. The officer's gaze lingered on the screens, then on the logs already filling with times and bearings. At last, he nodded. Maintain track. Do not classify. Do not broadcast beyond GroupNet. His words were firm, yet measured, an instruction both to continue and to contain. Minutes passed, each one marked by fresh anomalies. A blip appeared at 20,000 feet, hovered, then shot laterally, 50 miles in less than a second. Another dropped into the sea, vanishing beneath the radar horizon, as though the ocean had swallowed it whole. Operators recorded, recalculated, cross-checked, their discipline steady, even as their thoughts reeled. In the silence between reports, Sullivan whispered, almost to herself, "It's like they're playing with us." Reyes glanced at her, but said nothing. The words hung there anyway, unspoken but undeniable. Meanwhile, on the bridge, officers received condensed updates. The captain listened without visible reaction, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. "Log all anomalies," he ordered. No speculation. His voice was calm, absolute, yet those who knew him well caught the smallest flicker in his expression. Not fear, not even surprise, but recognition. By the time the hour had passed, the logs were thick with impossible data, altitudes that leapt and collapsed, velocities that defied known physics, tracks that ended not in gradual fade, but in abrupt vanishing. It was a pattern beyond any storm clutter, beyond any equipment glitch. The machines were functioning perfectly. The unknown was simply moving faster than understanding could follow. And though no alarms blared, though the ship's corridors carried on with their routines, those inside the Combat Information Center knew the night had changed. The ocean was no longer empty. The sky was no longer theirs alone. Something was moving in both, with a precision and speed that belonged to no nation, no fleet, no machine they had ever known. The flight deck was alive with light and motion. Flood lamps glowed pale against the darkness, guiding crews as they moved in, practiced choreography around the aircraft. Catapults hissed, steam rising faintly into the night air, and the smell of jet fuel mixed with the salt of the sea. For most aboard, this was routine, the nightly rhythm of launch operations. Yet tonight, a quiet tension rode beneath the noise, subtle but unmistakable. Pilots moved through their pre-flight checks with steady hands, but their eyes flicked often to the horizon. There, where the sea and sky met in darkness, faint lights still danced, and times they hovered like stars, too low to belong. At others, they streaked across the sky in abrupt bursts, shifting direction with sharpness no human aircraft could match. The lights left no trails, no thunder of engines, no sign of effort, only motion, precise and silent. On the deck, sailors paused in their duties, just long enough to watch. A launch officer, crouched by the nose of a waiting jet, caught sight of a sudden burst of light far above. For an instant, it seemed to plummet toward the sea, only to halt, perfectly still, before rising again. He lowered his flashlight, blinking, then forced himself back to his signals. Discipline demanded focus, but the sight lingered, replaying in his mind even as his arms gestured the next motion. Pilots, strapped into their cockpits, could see more clearly. Through helmet visors, the lights appeared sharp, metallic at times, glowing at others. One hovered above the western horizon, then darted laterally with speed so abrupt it seemed to vanish before reappearing dozens of miles away. Another blinked into view near the destroyer Jason Dunham, paused as though studying the ship, then slid upward into the thin air above the strike group. Inside the cockpits, voices filled the comms. "You seeing that?" one asked, tone calm but edged. "Affirm," came the reply. Another added, "No strobes, no nav lights, not one of ours." Their words were clipped, controlled, but beneath them lay the unease of professionals confronting something outside training, outside doctrine. On the catwalk, a petty officer whispered to his shipmate, "Stars don't move like that." The other nodded silently, unwilling to break the moment with words. Both returned their eyes to the deck, to the task at hand, but their thoughts were elsewhere, chasing the impossible motions above. The captain, informed by bridge officers, had authorized continued launches. Routine would not be broken, not yet, but on every level of the ship, awareness was spreading. The lights were not isolated. They were not tricks of the eye. They were present, above the deck, across the formation, defying every expectation of aircraft behavior. As the first jet thundered down the catapult and lifted into the night, the crew on deck held their breath. For a moment, all eyes followed the afterburners as they carved a trail upward. Beyond, faint against the stars, the strange lights shifted, as if in response. One rose higher, the other slid laterally, pacing the strike group's movement. From the Combat Information Center, voices relayed updates. Contact, visual confirmed by multiple ships. No radar return. Velocity, unknown. Each word was logged, each report careful. Yet for those on the flight deck, no logs were needed. They saw it with their own eyes. The objects moved in ways that no jet, no missile, no drone could hope to follow. For a moment, as more aircraft lined up for launch, silence fell across the deck. Not literal silence. The machinery roared, steam hissed, signals flashed, but within the minds of those present, there was a pause, a shared recognition. The world was not behaving as it should. Then the routine reclaimed them. Crews gestured, Engines ignited, jets rolled forward, the work continued, yet above the roar, in the dark expanse where sea met sky, the lights remained, darting, hovering, watching, and everyone aboard knew the night had shifted. The Atlantic night pressed heavy, but the strike group was alive with conversation. Across encrypted nets, the Gerald Ford's Combat Information Center traded updates with the destroyers in formation. It was routine to share radar tracks, to confirm air contacts, to check navigation bearings. Yet tonight, the tone was different. The words were clipped, precise, but beneath them lay a steady current of unease. On the USS Thomas Hutner, radar operators had logged the same anomalies: sharp descents from high altitude, abrupt lateral movements, vanishing contacts. Their scope showed the impossible: objects accelerating beyond Mach 20, then halting as if motion itself obeyed their command. The Jason Dunham's CIC confirmed similar returns. Each ship carried seasoned crews, men and women who had seen false echoes before. But this was not clutter. This was consistent, coordinated, real. Hudner, Ford. Do you confirm visual? The question carried across the net, measured and calm. A pause, then the reply. Affirmative. Multiple contacts observed. Bearing matches your log. Sullivan, listening on her headset aboard the Ford, glanced at Reyes. Both marked the confirmation in their logs, underlining the entry as though the weight of another ship's agreement made the words more tangible. Meanwhile, lookouts on the destroyers watched the same lights shift and dart above the horizon. Sailors leaned against the rails, binoculars pressed to their eyes, their murmured words carried only to the wind. "They're playing with us," one said softly. Another shook his head, muttering, "Not any bird I've ever seen." No one laughed. The night was too steady, too sharp. On the bridge of the Ford, the captain received each update in silence. His officers relayed bearings, times, altitudes. He nodded, gave no outward reaction, and finally spoke only 4 words: "Log it. Maintain course." The order was steady, yet those who heard it recognized its undertone: acknowledgement without conclusion, control without explanation. Back in the CIC, operators began to layer the data. Each ship's returns were plotted together, building a map of movements across the sky and sea. The pattern that emerged was baffling. Objects appeared simultaneously in multiple quadrants, then collapsed into a single track, then split again into pairs. No trajectory matched known physics. No velocity matched human craft. Still, the logs grew thicker. Bearings recorded, altitudes noted, velocities marked with question marks in the margins. Operators leaned closer to their screens, murmuring to one another, in tones low enough to hide from the officer of the watch. Reyes whispered, "They're toying with us, testing." Sullivan shook her head, replying only, "Or showing us." The destroyers confirmed another anomaly. One object had dipped below the radar horizon, vanishing into the sea. Moments later, a different ship reported a return climbing from the depths, shooting straight upward at impossible speed, subsurface to stratosphere, in less time than it took a radar sweep to circle. It was a maneuver that left engineers speechless, a transition no machine they knew could survive. At 21:15, a burst of chatter filled the net. An object had passed between the Ford and the Dunham, visible to both crews. Sailors described a faint metallic shape, glowing softly at its edges, moving without sound. It hovered briefly, then darted away, vanishing into the night. Both ships logged it, both confirmed, and both fell silent afterward. as though words could only diminish what they had seen. By now, the weight of confirmation was undeniable. 3 ships, multiple radars, dozens of eyes, all reporting the same impossible things. The data had shifted from anomaly to evidence, from whispers to certainty, and yet the orders remained steady. No alarm, no declaration, only the quiet continuation of course, the steady hum of engines, and the discipline of sailors who knew to record, not speculate. The ocean stretched unbroken, the sky gleamed with stars, and above it all the unknown moved freely, slipping between ships, between sensors, between the edges of human understanding. The Gerald Ford sailed on, flanked by its escorts, its logbooks thick with the weight of the night. For those who watched, the questions grew louder. For those who commanded, silence grew heavier. And in the dark waters of the Atlantic, the impossible was now undeniable. Chapter 4. Into the Sky. The order to launch came without flourish, delivered in the calm tone that masked urgency behind routine. On the flight deck, the words rippled outward, and the choreography of preparation tightened. Deck crews moved with a precision born of repetition, their gestures crisp under the pale glow of the deck lights. Steam hissed from catapults, and the scent of jet fuel filled the air, sharp and metallic against the salt of the ocean breeze. Pilots climbed into their cockpits, strapping in with practiced hands, voices steady over the comms as they ran through checklists. Inside the helmets, eyes glanced once more toward the horizon, where faint lights still danced against the dark. No one said aloud what lingered in their thoughts. This night's mission was no longer routine, yet their words remained clipped and precise. Controls green, fuel steady, weapons safed, systems online. The first FA-18 rolled into position, its nose pointed down the catapult track. The launch officer crouched low, flashlight directing the sequence. The deck vibrated under the engine's roar, a sound that filled the night with raw power. In the ready rooms below, sailors felt the rumble through steel bulkheads. On the bridge, the captain watched silently, his expression unchanged, though his gaze lingered longer than usual on the horizon. With a final signal, the jet leapt forward, a thunderous streak of light cutting into the sky. Its afterburners glowed brilliant against the darkness, fading as it climbed into the night. A second followed, then a third, each launched with seamless efficiency, the deck alive with motion yet balanced by discipline. Within minutes, a formation of fighters was airborne, climbing above the strike group, their voices crackling over comms with calm updates. Eagle 1 airborne, altitude 5,000 and climbing. Eagle 2 in formation, visual on Eagle 1. Eagle 3 airborne, systems nominal. Their words carried no hint of the strange lights, no mention of what their eyes might already be catching. Professionalism demanded restraint, yet behind the clipped reports, breaths came shorter, eyes swept wider, and hearts beat faster. From their vantage in the rising sky, the Atlantic stretched infinite, its surface a black mirror, broken only by the faint outlines of the ships below. The Gerald Ford was a small island of light, its escorts glowing dimly in formation, but beyond them the ocean swallowed everything. Above, the heavens opened wide, constellations scattering across the velvet dark, and there, moving against those familiar stars, were the lights. The first pilot saw them just as he leveled at 20,000 feet. 2 objects hung in the air, pale and metallic, their outlines blurred by a strange glow. They were not steady like stars, nor blinking like aircraft. They pulsed faintly, as though lit from within, then slid sideways in perfect unison. Control Eagle 1, we have visual contacts, the pilot said, his voice calm but clipped. Two objects, bearing 280, altitude approximate 25. The response from the carrier was immediate. Steady, Eagle 1, maintain visual, do not engage, log only. The pilot acknowledged, but his eyes stayed locked on the shapes. They moved with deliberate ease, shifting positions as though unconcerned with the fighters now climbing into their airspace. Another object appeared higher, brighter, then darted downward before halting suddenly, hanging motionless in the thin air. From the deck below, sailors craned their necks, watching the streaks of jets climb toward the unknown. Some whispered quietly, pointing to faint glows they swore were not stars. Others remained silent, their eyes wide, their hands stilled in mid-task, for only a heartbeat before they returned to duty. For the pilots above there was no doubt. The lights were not tricks of the horizon. They were present, tangible, deliberate, and as the formation settled into its patrol, the night carried a weight unlike any they had known before. The Gerald Ford's jets were in the sky, their engines cutting paths through darkness, but the sky itself was no longer theirs alone. The night sky above the Atlantic was clear, the stars scattered sharp and countless, their cold light mirrored faintly in the dark sea below. Against this canvas, the strike group's fighters cut their arcs upward, their afterburners trailing brief flares before dimming as they leveled at patrol altitude. From their cockpits, the horizon stretched unbroken, an endless expanse of water and sky. It was in that vast emptiness that the first object revealed itself. Lieutenant Commander Harris, flying lead, caught it just beyond his canopy's edge, a faint glow at first, hovering motionless against the constellations. He adjusted his visor, steadying his breath, expecting it to fade like so many illusions of night flying, but it remained, clear and sharp, metallic, shifting slightly in the starlight, as though its surface bent the glow rather than reflected it. Eagle 1, visual contact, Harris reported evenly. His words were calm, trained, but his eyes remained locked on the thing before him, bearing 275, altitude 23. Almost as if in reply, the object moved, not forward, not back, but sideways, sliding in a perfectly straight line across the sky, without tilt, without turn, without sound. It stopped abruptly, holding its place as though inertia did not exist. Then, with a flicker, it pulsed, a glow that seemed to radiate from within, a soft blue-white that outlined its shape. Harris saw it clearly now, an oval, domed at the top, its edges smooth, seamless, as if carved from a single piece of some unknown material. His wingman's voice crackled through the comms. Eagle 2, tally same, object confirmed. Another pilot chimed in moments later. Eagle 3, visual on multiple, count 3 contacts. The sky was no longer empty. Eagle 3, now 4. Objects hovered in formation above the Atlantic, their positions shifting with unnatural precision. One climbed vertically in an instant, stopping dead 10,000 feet higher, then glided back down with the ease of a falling leaf, though no air disturbed its motion. Another darted laterally, crossing miles in a second, only to halt as though it had never moved. From the carrier below, lookouts strained their eyes, glimpsing faint lights darting where stars should not be. To them, the movements were subtle, brief flashes of motion caught against the constellations. But to the pilots above, the truth was unmistakable. These were craft tangible and deliberate, their maneuvers unconcerned with gravity, wind, or the limits of human engineering. Inside the cockpits, tension built in silence. No one spoke of engagement. No one suggested interception. They knew the rules of contact: observe, log, report. Yet the objects seemed aware of them. One shifted closer, closing distance with a smoothness that made the air itself feel still. Harris gripped the stick tighter, his voice steady. Control, Eagle 1, closest contact within 10 miles. No transponder, no emissions. The reply from the Ford was measured. Eagle Flight, maintain course. Do not pursue, continue visual. The words were steady, but in the CIC below, officers leaned forward over consoles, their eyes fixed on screens that showed nothing. The radar remained clear, empty, blind to what the pilots now described in meticulous detail. As Harris watched, the closest object tilted, not in the way an aircraft banks for a turn, but as if the entire craft had rotated around an invisible axis. Its glow shifted, and for a moment, he thought he saw beneath it a darker core, perhaps structure, perhaps shadow. Then it pulsed again, brighter this time, and drifted away, faster than any jet could hope to match. The formation broke and reformed, the objects moving like dancers across the sky, silent and precise. To the human eye, it was both beautiful and unsettling, a display of motion that defied every known rule of flight. For the pilots, time seemed to stretch. Each second carried the weight of history, of bearing witness to something beyond training, beyond nation, beyond comprehension. And though their voices remained steady over comms, each knew that this night would never leave them. Above the Atlantic, under the cold gaze of the stars, the Gerald Ford's fighters had seen the unknown, and the unknown had seen them. The comms channels were built for clarity, for calm exchanges that left no room for hesitation. In training, pilots were taught to speak in clipped codes, to cut emotion from their words. But on this night, high above the Atlantic, the voices that filled the net carried something more, a thin thread of awe woven through the discipline. Eagle 1, contact maneuvering again, bearing 300, altitude climbing. Harris's tone was precise, yet beneath the words there was a weight that all listening could hear. Eagle 2 confirms, came the reply. Object just jumped 20,000 feet in 2 seconds. Still visual. A pause, then a quieter addition, almost muttered into the mic. That's impossible. The carrier's air traffic controller answered quickly, steady as a metronome. Eagle Flight, log all observations. Do not deviate. Maintain formation. The message carried authority, yet even through the calm, a slight hitch in the controller's breathing betrayed the strain of listening to descriptions his radar could not see. From Eagle 3, a younger pilot spoke, his voice rapid, barely restrained. Control. Object just executed a 90-degree turn. Velocity extreme. No contrail. No sonic boom. He broke off for a moment, then returned. I've never seen anything like this. Another pilot answered, his tone softer, as though speaking more to himself than the net. No aircraft can do that. No drone, nothing we know. There was silence for a moment, the kind that stretches across headsets, carrying the unspoken weight of recognition. Then Harris's voice cut back in, firmer, pulling the group into discipline. Stay focused. Keep logging. Eyes on. Below in the Combat Information Center, the radio chatter played through speakers, each word transcribed into logs. Operators exchanged quick glances, but kept their hands moving, marking times, bearings, altitudes. They heard the pilot's awe, their disbelief, but their own task was to record, to reduce the extraordinary into tidy lines of text. Still, the room carried a charge, as if every ear was tilted slightly closer to the voices in the sky. On the destroyers, sailors gathered near speakers, listening quietly as the reports flowed in. The words were calm, professional, yet the meaning was unmistakable. The impossible was happening above them. Some scribbled notes on scraps of paper. Others leaned against consoles with arms crossed, their faces unreadable, but their eyes wide. In the air, the objects continued their silent dance. One shot upward, vanishing into darkness, before reappearing at sea level, hovering motionless as if waiting. Another tilted sideways, its glow shifting, then darted between two fighters with such speed that the pilots had no time to react. Contact just crossed between Eagles 1 and 2, came the tight report. Separation less than a mile, no collision. Harris exhaled sharply, though he did not voice the thought that echoed in his mind. If it had wanted collision, nothing could have prevented it. The comms grew heavier with each report, not frantic, not panicked, but layered with disbelief. It's like they know we're here. They're pacing us. They're watching. The words slipped through, fragments not meant for the log, but carried nonetheless into the record of the night. On the bridge, the captain stood still, hands behind his back, listening. His officers cast quick glances toward him, searching his expression for guidance, for reaction, but his face remained composed, his voice calm when he finally spoke. Continue operations. Maintain course. He knew his words would be remembered, repeated in mess halls and compartments for years. Better they be steady, even if steady meant silence in the face of the unknown. The chatter continued, a chorus of voices caught between duty and wonder. Each pilot reported as trained, but each left traces of awe threaded through the lines. Disbelief in the speed, astonishment at the silence, unease at the precision, and in those voices, the weight of the night deepened. Above the Atlantic, the Gerald Ford's pilots flew not against an enemy, nor in a drill, but in the presence of something other. Their radios carried the proof, words logged in real time, words that revealed more than the objects themselves. The human heart, steady and afraid, disciplined, yet undone by wonder. Chapter 5. Silence on the deck. The flight deck, moments before alive with launch activity, now shifted into its other rhythm, recovery. The night air trembled with the roar of jets circling back, their engines echoing across the sea before aligning with the carrier's lights. Landing signals flashed, arresting wires stretched, and crews braced for the thunderous impact of steel on steel. One by one, the F/A-18s returned. Tires screeched, hooks caught cables, and the jets shuddered to a halt in showers of sparks. The sequence was practiced, precise, yet the atmosphere felt different now. Sailors moved quickly to clear each jet, but their eyes lingered on the cockpits. They searched the pilots' faces for clues, some sign of what they had seen up there. And though helmets and visors concealed much, the set of a jaw, the pause before a canopy lifted, carried more weight than words. Lieutenant Commander Harris was the first to climb down from his cockpit. His movements were steady, disciplined, but his eyes, shadowed beneath his helmet, held a distance, the look of someone who had seen something beyond language. He exchanged only a brief nod with the deck crew before walking briskly toward the island's superstructure. His wingman followed, pausing just long enough to mutter to a technician, "Keep your eyes on the sky tonight." Then he disappeared below deck. In the ready room, the air was thick with silence. Pilots removed helmets, wiped sweat from brows, and sat heavily in their chairs. Usually, post-sortie chatter filled the space, jokes about maneuvers, quiet grumbles about turbulence, the casual rhythm of professionals easing tension. Tonight, no one spoke at first. The hum of the air conditioning and the distant thrum of engines were the only sounds. The debrief officer entered, clipboard in hand, his tone even. "All right, gentlemen, walk me through it." His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed curiosity. He had heard the chatter over comms. He knew what the logs now contained. Still, he began as always. Altitude, speed, positions. Facts first. Always facts. Harris leaned forward, elbows on knees, his voice low. Visual contact with multiple objects. Maneuvers outside flight envelope. He paused, searching for words that would not sound absurd. Acceleration instantaneous, directional changes without banking, velocity beyond any known craft. The officer scribbled, his pen scratching quickly. Number of contacts, 4 at minimum, possibly 5. Formation shifts, deliberate. Another pilot added, no sound, no contrail. Surfaces glowed faint, metallic sheen. They responded to our presence. He glanced down at his hands, fingers clasped tightly, one crossed within a mile. Fastest thing I've ever seen. The room remained still. The pilot spoke quietly, each detail layered with care, each pause heavy with memory. There was no exaggeration, no bravado, only precision, the language of professionals who understood that their words would become record. And yet, beneath that precision, something else lingered, the awe of men and women confronting what they could not frame within training. The debrief officer asked again, any emissions, radar locks, weapons systems indications? All shook their heads. Negative, Harris said firmly. Radar blind, systems clean, nothing on scope, pure visual. The officer nodded slowly, his pen pausing at last. He looked around the room, at the faces drawn tight with restraint, and gave the faintest exhale. Understood. Log it as observed. Keep discussion minimal outside this room. The words were not a warning, not yet, but a reminder, spoken softly, yet heavy with implication. The pilots exchanged brief glances. Each understood. The night's events were already slipping from open conversation into the quiet corridors of secrecy. When the debrief ended, the pilots filed out silently, their boots heavy against the deck. Behind them, the logs remained, words on paper, stripped of tone, stripped of awe. Yet the men and women who had spoken them carried more than words. They carried the weight of memory, the burden of sights that could never be fully explained. Above them, the Atlantic rolled on in darkness, silent and vast, but the sky was no longer ordinary, and none of them would ever see it that way again. In a dimly lit compartment, deep within the Gerald Ford, the first recordings from the night's flights were queued for review. The room was hushed, its walls lined with consoles and monitors that flickered in shades of gray and green. Officers sat in rows, their uniforms pressed, their expressions tight, as technicians prepared the feeds captured from cockpit cameras and infrared systems. Ordinarily, such reviews followed a predictable rhythm. Angles checked, timestamps verified, radar overlays compared with visual logs. The process was clinical, unremarkable, the kind of quiet labor that turned raw data into reports. But tonight, the air carried something heavier. Everyone present had already heard the pilot's words. Now, they would see for themselves what the machines had managed to capture. The first video opened with the familiar grain of infrared. A fighter's nose camera showed the horizon, steady and uneventful, until abruptly a faint shape appeared. At first it was no more than a blur, a small oval pulsing faintly against the cold black background. The blur elongated, darted sideways, and froze again, its edges sharp enough to suggest structure, but indistinct, as if the sensors strained to keep pace. "Freeze there," an officer ordered. The frame held, showing the object locked mid-motion. Its outline was smooth, seamless. No wings, no fuselage, no exhaust, just a shape that seemed to pulse with its own energy. "Speed?" someone asked. The technician checked overlays. From this position to here, he advanced the frames a fraction. "That's over 40 miles. Less than a second elapsed." He looked up, uncertain whether to continue. The numbers spoke loudly enough. The next recording displayed an even stranger anomaly. As a jet banked across the sky, its targeting pod tracked a contact moving erratically. For several seconds, the object held steady, then suddenly blinked out. Frames passed in emptiness. When it reappeared, it was thousands of feet higher, the pod struggling to lock onto it again. The transition left no trace, no blur of motion, only absence followed by presence. The reviewing officers leaned closer. One, a commander with years of experience, exhaled slowly. "That's not a glitch." The system recorded the jump. His words hung in the air, measured, impossible to dismiss. Another file opened, this one visual from a cockpit camera. Against the dark night sky, a faint glow pulsed. The pilot's breathing could be heard through the mic, steady but audible. The object shifted left, then right, crossing the field of view in abrupt, precise bursts. At one point, it darted directly toward the jet, filling the screen with light, before veering away at an impossible angle. The feed shook as the pilot adjusted, his voice calm but tense. "Object within 1 mile, passing port side." The officers exchanged glances. The footage was real, unaltered, raw, and yet, even as it confirmed the impossible, it refused to give clarity. The objects remained elusive, their outlines blurred, their nature undefined. The cameras had captured something tangible, but never fully enough to explain. Then came the strangest file. A feed began normally, showing stars and horizon, the cockpit's faint heads-up display. An object entered the frame, sharp, distinct, metallic, domed, luminous. For 5 seconds it held steady, clear as day, and then, without warning, the recording cut to static. Not a system freeze, not a gradual fade, just static, pure and sudden, as if the connection itself had been severed. The technician rewound, played it again. The result was the same. The clearest image of the night vanished exactly at its peak, erased in the space of a single frame. The reviewing officer rubbed his brow, his voice low. "We have enough to know, not enough to show." It was both a conclusion and a dismissal, the kind of phrase that closed conversation rather than opened it. The others nodded silently, each understanding what it meant. The evidence existed, yes, but it was incomplete, fragmented, riddled with absences at the very moments that mattered most. Enough to confirm that something extraordinary had been there, never enough to explain it. The logs would reflect what could be verified. The rest, the awe, the disbelief, the missing frames, would fade into silence. The review room emptied slowly, the officers leaving in pairs or alone, their faces unreadable. The logs and footage were secured, drives sealed into cases marked with red tape, signatures scrawled on forms that would be filed under layers of classification. What had begun as a routine exercise had ended in evidence too strange for daylight, too disruptive for open record. The decision was unspoken, but everyone felt it. This night would not be spoken of freely. On the bridge, the captain stood with his arms folded, listening as the last reports came in. His officers delivered their words with practiced calm. Radar anomalies confirmed, visuals logged, footage reviewed, but their eyes betrayed unease, small flickers of doubt that training could not fully erase. The captain nodded at each, then turned to his executive officer. Draft a restricted report. Eyes only. Circulate no wider than the group. The order was delivered quietly, almost casually, yet its weight rippled outward. Within hours, new protocols spread across the ship. Sailors in the Combat Information Center were told to file their logs under sealed classification. Pilots were reminded to avoid casual discussion outside their ready rooms. Lookouts and deck crew received the same instruction: no speculation, no stories, no chatter over meals. What had been awe and whispers only hours before was now silence pressed into regulation. In the mess halls, conversations shifted abruptly. Where sailors had leaned close earlier, trading fragments of what they'd glimpsed, they now lowered their voices or fell silent altogether. Laughter dimmed. Utensils clinked against trays with greater clarity, filling the spaces left by words unsaid. Those who had seen the lights with their own eyes avoided direct mention, their thoughts trapped behind half-finished sentences. Late into the night, selected officers were called into a closed briefing. The compartment was small, its lights dim, its walls bare except for a single screen displaying a frozen frame of one of the objects, blurred, indistinct, yet undeniable. The captain spoke little. He outlined the sequence of events, listed the evidence, then issued the only directive that mattered. This remains internal. No external communication. Records will be secured. Questions will not be pursued outside authorized channels. The words were plain, stripped of flourish, but their impact was sharp. Each officer understood the meaning. This was no longer theirs to discuss. It belonged to classification, to silence. The unknown had crossed their sky, but the telling of it would be confined to sealed rooms and locked cases. Some nodded without hesitation, accustomed to secrecy as part of duty. Others hesitated inwardly, though they gave no sign. The weight of memory pressed on them, the lights darting across the sky, the voices of pilots caught between awe and disbelief, the missing frames of footage. These things lived vividly in their minds, yet they would not live openly in record. When the briefing ended, the officers dispersed quietly, their footsteps echoing down the steel corridors. Each carried the burden differently. For some, it was just another layer of classified knowledge, one among many. For others, it was something stranger, heavier, the sense that they had brushed against a truth larger than secrecy itself, and now were required to pretend it had never touched them. On deck, the ocean rolled on in darkness, indifferent to orders and classifications. The stars above shone as they always had, silent witnesses to the night's passage. Sailors stood watch, their eyes scanning horizons that seemed wider now, more mysterious. The official word was to maintain course, maintain silence. Yet inside, each carried the quiet certainty that they had seen something that no order could erase. The Gerald Ford moved forward, engines thrumming, her escorts keeping formation. To the world beyond the horizon, nothing had changed. But within her steel hull, the night's events lived as both presence and absence, experienced by many, spoken by none. And so the ship sailed under silence, its logs sealed, its voices contained, while above the Atlantic, the unknown remained free. Chapter 6. The Weight of Secrecy. Morning came softly to the Gerald Ford, though out at sea the cycle of light and dark mattered less than the rhythm of duty. Breakfast was served on schedule, trays sliding across steel counters, the mess hall filling with the low hum of conversation. To a casual ear, it sounded as it always did. Laughter here, complaints about the coffee there, voices rising and falling with the easy familiarity of shipboard life. Yet beneath that hum, another current ran quieter, heavier. The night's events had already begun to spread, not in official reports, those were sealed and locked away, but in fragments carried from one watchstander to another, from pilots to mechanics, from radar operators to friends, trusted enough to whisper in the corner of a meal. The words came out hesitantly, often wrapped in disclaimers. Might have been a trick of the scope, could have been glare on the canopy, but the hesitations could not conceal the truth. Too many had seen, too many had heard, for silence to hold completely. At one table, two young sailors leaned close, their voices just above a whisper. Reyes told me the thing dropped from 30,000 feet, just straight down. No trail, no sound. His companion frowned, shaking his head. That's not possible. The first shrugged. He swore it, said Sullivan saw it too. They fell silent as another group passed, then resumed, softer still, and the pilots saw more. That's what they're not telling us. In another corner, a mechanic who had serviced one of the jets spoke in low tones. You should have seen Harris's face when he came off the flight line. Guy looked like he'd seen a ghost. Didn't say a word, just walked right past. His listeners nodded, eyes wide. No one questioned Harris's composure. If he had been shaken, then something extraordinary must have happened. Even those who had not seen the objects themselves felt the shift. The mood in the mess was changed, as though everyone had woken into a world that was the same in appearance, but altered in substance. Laughter was softer, glances were sharper, conversations ended abruptly when officers walked past. For the officers themselves, the weight was different. They carried the direct orders. Silence, classification, no speculation. Yet even they could not completely mask the unease. Over coffee, two lieutenants exchanged clipped phrases, each careful not to speak too plainly. Footage didn't line up. One muttered, "Frames missing, just gone." The other stirred his cup slowly, replying only, "We've seen anomalies before. Leave it at that." Their words ended there, but the pause between them carried far more. Down in berthing compartments, whispers spread like currents in the sea. Sailors lying in their racks leaned close to one another, voices muffled by drawn curtains. Some told what they had seen on deck, lights darting across the sky, shapes hovering where no aircraft should be. Others relayed fragments of comms they'd overheard, pilots describing 90-degree turns, objects pacing their formations. The stories wove together, growing stronger with each retelling, filling the silence left by official restraint. And yet, fear did not dominate these whispers. What lingered instead was awe, the sense of having brushed against something larger than themselves, something beyond the reach of explanation. For many, the secrecy only deepened the wonder. If the officers were keeping silent, then surely what they had seen was extraordinary. Still, tension clung to the air. Everyone knew the unspoken boundaries. To speak too loudly, to speculate too freely, was to risk attention from the wrong ears. Intelligence officers had been seen already, strangers in dark uniforms, asking quiet questions. Their presence was reminder enough. Curiosity was dangerous, silence safer. But sailors are human. and humans share stories. And so the Gerald Ford moved through the Atlantic morning, with its mess halls filled not only with the smell of eggs and coffee, but with murmured fragments of the night before, stories half spoken, truths half hidden, awe and unease bound together. The strike group sailed on in perfect formation, engines steady, radars sweeping. To the outside world, it was another ordinary patrol, but within the steel walls of the Gerald Ford, silence was no longer empty, it was crowded with whispers. By late afternoon, the Gerald Ford carried an unfamiliar presence. It arrived not with ceremony or announcement, but with the subtle precision of those who lived in the world of classified corridors. A helicopter set down on the deck, its rotors thundering briefly before settling into silence. From it stepped several men in dark uniforms, their faces calm, their movements purposeful. They wore no patches to mark their command, no insignia beyond the faint glint of rank. To most sailors, they were strangers, neither part of the ship's crew nor the familiar rotation of fleet staff. Their arrival passed quietly at first. Flight deck crews noted their presence but said nothing. Sailors moving through passageways noticed the strangers slipping by, clipboards in hand, voices low, their eyes sharp. Word spread quickly. Intelligence officers, not the kind who mingled with everyday operations, but the kind who appeared only when something unusual had occurred, the kind who asked questions and left with files no one else would ever see again. In the Combat Information Center, the mood shifted the moment they entered. The hum of consoles continued, but conversation dimmed. Reyes and Sullivan, still on duty, felt the weight immediately. The lead officer stepped behind their consoles, silent for a long moment as he observed the screens. Then, in a voice calm but unmistakably firm, he asked, "Show me last night's logs." Reyes hesitated only a second before sliding the binder across. The officer flipped through it with quick, efficient motions, his eyes scanning each line of handwriting, pausing at times to underline a timestamp. "You recorded intermittent contacts." "Yes, sir," Reyes answered. "Velocity estimates. Beyond conventional," Reyes said carefully. The officer nodded, offering no reaction, no judgment. He closed the log and placed it back with precision. "From this moment forward, these entries are classified. You will not discuss them outside authorized channels." The words were spoken as instruction, not suggestion. Sullivan and Reyes exchanged a glance, then both nodded. Elsewhere, in ready rooms and berthing spaces, similar questions were being asked. Pilots were interviewed individually, their testimonies cross-checked against recordings. The officer's approach was never loud, never aggressive. They asked with calm precision, each question framed as though the answers were already known. "Describe the object. At what range did it cross? Did you feel any system interference?" The pilots replied with steady voices, their professionalism intact, but beneath their words lingered unease. They knew their accounts were being absorbed into silence. In the hangar bay, technicians who had inspected aircraft were approached. Any anomalies in system diagnostics? Any sensor errors? They shook their heads, reporting clean checks. Still, the officers took notes, their pens moving quickly, their faces unreadable. When one mechanic attempted a nervous joke, "You guys sure this wasn't a training op we weren't told about?" The officer only gave a faint smile that held no warmth. By evening, the officer's presence was felt in every corner of the ship. Sailors grew quieter in the mess, their conversations clipped when strangers entered. The hum of ordinary life continued. Meals served, decks scrubbed, machinery tended, Yet beneath it all was the awareness that watchful eyes were everywhere. The Gerald Ford was a fortress, but tonight it felt like a vessel carrying secrets too heavy for its steel. On the bridge, the captain conferred privately with the intelligence officers. Their words did not carry across the deck, but their body language spoke enough. Papers exchanged hands. Drives were passed over. The captain nodded gravely at intervals, his jaw tight, his face as unreadable as the officers themselves. By nightfall, the strangers had spread across compartments like shadows, asking, listening, noting. They carried no threats, spoke with no raised voices, but their presence alone altered the air. They were the embodiment of silence, a reminder that some truths would not belong to those who had seen them, but to the vaults where such truths were locked away. The sailors watched quietly as the officers moved on, and though few words were spoken, the thought repeated silently across the ship. The unknown had not only crossed the skies above them, it had crossed into their lives, and now it was being taken away, piece by piece, into silence. By the second night after the encounter, the Gerald Ford felt changed. The same routines unfolded. Watches stood, aircraft serviced, meals served, but beneath the hum of machinery and order lay a quieter rhythm, one of sealed files and whispered reminders. In the Combat Information Center, the change was most apparent. Operators reported for duty as usual, their eyes adjusting to the soft glow of screens. Yet the logs they had kept so diligently only a day before were gone. In their place sat blank binders, clean pages awaiting ordinary entries. When Reyes asked quietly where the old logs had been moved, the supervisor replied simply, "Secured, higher classification." His tone left no room for follow-up. Technicians noticed it too. The data drives from the radar and sensor suites had been collected early that morning. A pair of intelligence officers carried them in black cases, signatures scrawled on a chain of custody form, before vanishing with them into the captain's quarters. Word spread quickly. The very records that proved the impossible maneuvers were no longer aboard for common eyes. They were out of reach, out of sight, absorbed into a system sailors called, with half a smile and half a shiver, the vault. In ready rooms, pilots found their debrief notes missing as well. What they had written immediately after landing, observations, sketches, coordinates, had been taken. The paper copies vanished into folders. The digital files once stored on secure terminals now prompted error messages, access restricted. The pilots exchanged quiet looks, but said little. Their silence was less a choice than a recognition. Mess hall conversations grew sharper at the edges. A sailor who asked too many questions at lunch found himself met with blank stares. A mechanic who speculated aloud about craft from somewhere else received only a curt reminder from his chief, "Keep it to yourself." Even laughter, when it came, felt thinner, as though joy itself had to pass through filters before being allowed. The intelligence officers were still present, moving through compartments like shadows. They did not shout, did not threaten. Instead, they asked questions in voices too calm to refuse. Who else have you spoken to? What did you tell them? What do you remember most clearly? The sailors answered carefully, aware that words could carry consequences. The officers wrote everything down, their pens steady, their faces unreadable. At one point, Sullivan caught sight of her own handwriting, a copy of the radar log she had kept during the first anomalies. The officer holding it slid the paper into a folder, tapped it twice to align the edges, and closed it with a snap. He met her eyes briefly, gave the faintest nod, and walked away. She felt the moment like a door shutting, one more piece of the night's truth removed from her hands. By evening, new briefings spread across the crew. The message was consistent, repeated until it became almost litany. You saw weather, you saw reflections, you saw nothing unusual. No one believed it, yet no one openly contested it. Discipline required obedience, and obedience meant silence. Still, the memory remained. Pilots lying in their racks replayed the shapes, darting across the sky. Sailors on deck glanced upward more often, scanning stars as though expecting them to move. Operators in the CIC hesitated before logging even the faintest anomaly, their pens hovering just long enough to betray doubt. The ship itself sailed on, engines thrumming, formation tight. To the outside world, nothing had changed, but within its steel corridors, the Gerald Ford had become a vessel carrying more than men and machines. It carried secrets, locked in cases, sealed in vaults, hidden behind orders, and it carried silence, a silence that pressed heavier than the ocean itself. The unknown had come and gone, the records had been taken, the voices had been hushed. All that remained were memories, and the quiet certainty that somewhere, locked far from the ship that had witnessed them, the truth was already being rewritten. Chapter 7: Testimony and Memory. Time softened the sharpness of that night, but it never erased it. For the men and women who had flown into the sky above the Gerald Ford, the memory lived quietly, tucked into corners of thought, surfacing in dreams, carried like a burden that could not be shared openly. The years that followed brought promotions, transfers, retirements. New ships sailed, new missions came and went. But for those who had been airborne when the unknown revealed itself, the night remained, shaping them in ways that silence alone could not contain. Interviews came slowly, years later, often off the record, sometimes whispered, in private conversations with trusted friends or researchers. The voices of the pilots were steady, but their words were layered with pauses, as though weighed against unseen boundaries. Lieutenant Commander Harris, long since retired, sat once with a small group in a dim conference room far from the sea. He spoke calmly, choosing phrases with precision. "I can't tell you what it was," he said, his hands folded, eyes distant. "It wasn't an aircraft we know. It didn't move like anything in our inventory. No jet, no drone, nothing. It moved as if inertia didn't apply." He stopped there, the silence stretching. Listeners leaned in, waiting, but Harris only shook his head faintly, as if the rest was better left unsaid. Another pilot, younger at the time of the encounter, shared her account in a more hesitant voice. She had risen to command later in her career, but when asked about that night, her tone softened. "It's the way it felt," she said, "not just what we saw. You spend years learning to read the air, to feel how machines respond. That night, it was like the sky itself changed around us, as though we weren't in control of the space anymore." She paused, then added quietly, "We were being watched." Their testimonies were never shouted, never dramatized. They were offered like fragments, glimpses of memory carefully wrapped to avoid drawing too much attention. Some refused to speak at all, shaking their heads, closing their mouths, letting silence answer where words could not. Others shared only in metaphor, speaking of lights that rode across the dark, or machines without weight. Researchers who collected these accounts often noted the same pattern. Professionalism carried into every sentence. There were no exaggerations, no attempts to explain, only careful observations, as though the pilots were still in their cockpits, still reporting over comms. Yet beneath the clipped tone, the awe lingered, awe and something heavier, the fatigue of carrying a truth that could never be fully released. One pilot, interviewed late in life, said it most plainly. We all signed papers, we all followed orders, but the thing is, silence doesn't erase memory. I still see it, clear as then, the way it darted, the way it hovered, the way it looked at us. If that's even the right word, I see it every time I close my eyes. His voice had grown soft, almost a whisper. It's a weight you learn to live with, but it never leaves. Across the years, their accounts varied in detail, but never in essence. Objects that moved without sound, velocities that defied physics, a presence that seemed deliberate. Each description reinforced the others, a chorus of testimonies given softly, cautiously, always with pauses that hinted at more. The official record, of course, remained unchanged. The logs were sealed, the footage classified, the reports locked in vaults. Publicly, nothing extraordinary had ever happened, but in the quiet words of those who had been there, the truth endured, not as open declaration, but as memory, carried carefully, shared sparingly, and remembered always. For the radar operators, memory was not of the sky, but of the screens, glowing arcs, sweeping lines, the language of blips and echoes that had defined their lives at sea. Years later, those who had sat in the Gerald Ford's Combat Information Center during that night carried their recollections differently from the pilots. Where the pilots remembered shapes and lights, the operators remembered absence, the silence of machines that should have spoken, the blankness where data should have lived. Petty Officer Sullivan, long since out of the Navy, described it quietly in an interview with a civilian researcher. You trust the radar more than your own eyes, she said. That's what they teach you. The scope doesn't lie. The scope sees what you can't. But that night, the scope lied. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe it told us the truth that we weren't supposed to see. She trailed off then, unwilling to say more, but her words hung like an unanswered question. Reyes, her partner at the console that night, gave his memory with more precision. 30,000 feet to sea level in a single sweep, he said, repeating the phrase as if it were etched into him. Not a descent, not turbulence. Just there, then not. Gone, like it had stepped outside the system. His voice was steady, but his hands fidgeted as he spoke, a habit that had lingered since those long hours in the CIC. Other operators recalled the moments after, when the intelligence officers collected the logs. One remembered watching his handwriting vanish into a folder, knowing it would never return. Another recalled the exact sound of the officer's pen, scratching as it crossed out entire lines before replacing them with the bland phrase anomalous clutter. Years later, those sounds echoed louder in memory than the faint hum of the radar itself. It was the silence afterward, one sailor admitted. That's what stayed with me. We'd seen the anomalies, we'd marked them, we'd talked about them, and then, nothing. We weren't allowed to mention them again. It was as if the night had been erased while we were still living in it. They spoke of the atmosphere that followed, the mess halls quieter, the watchstanders more cautious, the ordinary rhythm of shipboard life bent slightly out of shape. To outsiders, the Gerald Ford had been just another carrier on patrol. To those inside, the weight of missing data, missing files, missing voices pressed harder than the ocean itself. Some radar operators found themselves haunted, not by what they saw, but by what they didn't. When you spend your life on radar, one explained, you develop a feel for patterns, for what's noise and what's not. That night, the pattern was wrong, not broken, not clutter. Wrong, like it was running on rules we didn't understand. His voice grew quieter, and then they took the logs. and without the logs, all we had was memory. And memory isn't supposed to be evidence. The missing files became their own kind of presence. Sailors who later filed routine paperwork would stumble over the gaps, entries scrubbed, notes vanished, anomalies absent where they had once been written. The silence was official, stamped and filed, but inside the operators carried their own records, not on paper, not in drives, but in the rhythm of recall that surfaced in dreams and late-night conversations. For them, the burden was not wonder, as it had been for the pilots. It was dissonance. Machines that should have told the truth had faltered, records that should have endured had vanished, and they were left with the uneasy knowledge that the sea and sky had revealed something extraordinary, only for the system to fold it away until even memory felt forbidden. Time passed, but the memory remained, carried quietly in the minds of those who had witnessed the night above the Gerald Ford. The burden was not simply what they had seen, nor the anomalies they had logged. It was the silence afterward, the way their experiences had been gathered into folders, sealed, and taken away, leaving them with nothing but the weight of recollection. To remember was to hold something that could not be spoken aloud. For some, the burden surfaced in private conversations with family, shared cautiously across kitchen tables years later. A father telling his son in a low voice, "There are things I can't explain, things I was told not to talk about." The son listening wide-eyed, sensing both pride and hesitation in his father's words. For others, the memory never left their own lips. They carried it silently, tucked behind the walls of discipline and duty, refusing to place their loved ones under the same shadow. Pilots often described dreams that never faded. In sleep, they saw again the lights darting across the sky, felt the weightless sense of being observed from above. They woke with steady breaths but restless minds, the dream indistinguishable from memory. Radar operators reported something different: the endless sweep of the scope, the anticipation of anomalies that never appeared again, the ghost of a blip just beyond vision. Their dreams were filled not with presence but with absence. Silence replayed night after night. Some turned to metaphor, speaking of the encounter only in symbolic terms. It was like seeing the ocean stand still, one pilot said years later, like watching gravity take a breath. Another described it as a reminder that we're children in a universe much larger than we imagine. These phrases slipped more easily into conversation, cloaked in wonder rather than confession. They were safer, less likely to draw attention. Yet the truth lay beneath them, unspoken but undeniable. What weighed most heavily was not fear of ridicule, though that lingered too, but fear of consequence. They had seen what happened to logs, to files, to official records. They had watched as evidence was taken away, leaving behind only blank pages. To speak openly was to risk becoming the next thing erased. And so the burden remained internal, shaping them quietly but profoundly. It showed in subtle ways: a sailor who grew quieter after the deployment, less eager to laugh, more prone to staring at the night sky in silence. An officer who carried a sharper edge of caution, as though always weighing his words before speaking. A pilot who, even in retirement, scanned the horizon every time she flew commercial, eyes flicking toward any glint or flash of light. Each carried their memory differently, but all carried it. Researchers who encountered these men and women later often noted their restraint. They did not embellish, they did not dramatize. Their stories came in careful pieces, delivered with pauses, measured like classified briefings, and often, just as the conversation seemed to touch the heart of the matter, they would stop, shake their heads, and murmur, "That's enough." The silence that followed said more than the words themselves. For those who had been there, the night was not simply a story of strange objects in the sky. It was a story of how quickly extraordinary truth could be folded into silence, how memory itself became both evidence and prison. They bore it with quiet dignity, but it marked them, leaving a trace in their voices, their eyes, their long pauses. The Gerald Ford sailed on, her patrols recorded in clean logs and official histories. But for the crew who had been there, the true history lived elsewhere, in their minds, their dreams, their silences. And though they were not supposed to tell, the burden of memory ensured that they never truly forgot. Chapter 8. Myths of the Deep Sea. Long before carriers roamed the oceans, long before radar swept the skies, sailors told stories of strange lights over the waves. The sea, vast and inscrutable, had always been a stage for mysteries. In the quiet hours of night watch, when the horizon blurred into the stars, men at the tiller whispered of things that moved where no ship should be, of glows beneath the water, of phantom sails on the horizon that vanished at dawn. The Gerald Ford's crew, though clad in modern uniforms and guided by advanced machinery, had stepped into the same ancient current of awe. What they had witnessed in the Atlantic was not new, not entirely. It was part of a lineage stretching back through centuries, a continuum of encounters where ocean and sky conspired to reveal the inexplicable. Old logbooks, preserved in maritime archives, told of lights that danced along rigging, sometimes called St. Elmo's fire. To sailors of the age of sail, these were omens, sometimes blessings, sometimes warnings. They spoke of glowing spheres that rolled across decks during storms, and of fire that seemed to drip from the masts themselves. Modern science offered explanations of plasma and static, yet even with explanations, the awe lingered. The sight of the sea, illuminated by its own mystery, was something no equation could fully erase. Other tales ran darker. Fishermen off the coasts of Japan whispered of umibuzu, shadowy figures that rose from the waves, immense and silent, vanishing before nets could be cast. Vikings spoke of serpents that coiled beneath the waves, their backs breaking the surface like islands that moved. And scattered among these myths were quieter notes, reports of lights gliding under the sea, keeping pace with vessels, vanishing when pursued. Centuries before submarines or undersea cables, men described the ocean glowing from within, as though it too carried its own sky. In the 19th century, clipper ship captains wrote of phantom ships that appeared in full sail, glowing faintly, only to vanish without sound or splash. Some dismissed them as mirages, tricks of temperature and light. Others swore the visions were real, echoes of ships lost to storms, sailing still in some hidden dimension of the sea. The most famous of these was the Flying Dutchman, cursed to wander forever. For sailors who glimpsed her, the sight was both awe and warning, a reminder that the ocean was a realm that answered to no master. The Gerald Ford's crew would not have spoken of serpents or cursed ships. Their language was the language of vectors, bearings, altitudes, and speeds. Yet at its heart, their experience was the same as those who had gone before, a confrontation with something beyond explanation, carried into memory, transformed into whisper and silence. For centuries, sailors comforted themselves by weaving stories around the unknown. To name a thing was to hold it at bay, to tame its terror or magnify its wonder. The men and women of the ford could not so easily name what they had seen. They had only the sterile words of logs and the heavy weight of classification, yet inside, they knew they had joined that older chorus, the timeless lineage of those who looked across the sea and found it staring back. On quiet nights, long after the encounter, some of them admitted, if only to themselves, that they now understood the old myths better. Perhaps the phantom ships and serpent tales were not exaggerations, but the language of their time. Perhaps lights beneath the waves were not fantasy, but the same presence that had danced above the Gerald Ford's flight deck. The ocean, after all, keeps its secrets well. And so in the carrier's mess halls and on her dark catwalks, whispers joined whispers. Some spoke of what radar could not see. Others remembered the awe in their pilots' voices, and a few, staring out over the black water, thought of the sailors of centuries past, men and women who had stood where sea meets sky and found themselves not alone. The Atlantic stretched around the Gerald Ford like an endless mirror of history. Its waters had carried empires, explorers, and entire generations of sailors. Each left behind stories, some written in neat logs, others carried only in voice and memory. And now, among those long currents of lore, the carrier's crew found themselves linked to a lineage far older than their steel decks and digital screens. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Sailors centuries ago described lights that paced their ships without sound, gliding above or below the waves. The Ford's pilots, staring into the night sky, reported the same, objects that moved as if drawn by invisible hands, keeping pace without effort. The words had changed. Where old seafarers spoke of fire and spheres, modern sailors spoke of contacts and maneuvers. Yet the essence was identical, an encounter with presences that defied the limits of their world. Researchers had often pointed to the strange consistency of such reports. In the 1600s, Spanish galleons recorded globes of silver light, appearing above their masts, vanishing into the sea. In the 1800s, British naval officers wrote of machines of fire rising silently from beneath the waves near the Azores. And in the 20th century, submarine crews during wartime logged luminous objects pacing them underwater, ignoring depth and pressure alike. Across the centuries, details shifted, but the pattern remained. Lights, speed, silence. A presence that came and went without leaving evidence, only memory. For the Gerald Ford's crew, the recognition came quietly, in private thoughts, sitting in mess halls or standing on catwalks. They considered the possibility that they had joined this continuum, that their experience was not unique, not even rare, but simply the latest verse in a song the sea had been singing for millennia. To admit it aloud would have been risky. To admit it silently in the privacy of their minds was unavoidable. Some wondered if the ocean itself was the keeper of the secret. Myths across cultures spoke of civilizations beneath the waves, Atlantis in the west, Lemuria in the east, Hy-Brasil in Irish lore, places where knowledge older than mankind was said to dwell, hidden from sight but not from influence. When objects rose from the depths beside the Gerald Ford, darting into the stratosphere, more than one sailor thought of those myths. If something had always been here, hidden in the sea, then perhaps humanity had only ever caught its reflections, scattered across history like fragments of a greater whole. Others drew comparisons to the legends of ghost ships. The Flying Dutchman, cursed to wander forever, was once dismissed as superstition, yet modern accounts of glowing craft gliding silently across waves carried an eerie similarity. Both were glimpses of something that should not exist, crossing human paths without explanation. The Ford's encounter, though steeped in the language of radar and modern aviation, carried the same echo, a vessel not of this world, glimpsed briefly, then gone. Even the old tales of sea serpents and monsters seemed less fanciful in the light of modern mystery. To eyes untrained in machinery, a darting light beneath the waves might appear as the undulating body of a beast. To ears unused to silence, the absence of sound from such movement could only be explained as supernatural. What the Ford sailors saw as metallic forms, their ancestors may have seen as living creatures. The sea had always offered the unknown. Humanity had always clothed it in the language it understood best. In this way, the Gerald Ford's encounter was not an interruption of history, but its continuation. It was proof, at least to those who witnessed it, that the ocean's mysteries were not relics of the past. They lived still, adapting their form to each age, revealing themselves just enough to remind sailors that mastery of the sea is always partial. And so the carrier's name joined a list older than navies, older than nations. From the whispers of Phoenician traders to the diaries of Viking navigators, from the parchment logs of clipper captains to the sealed files of modern fleets, the same story carried forward. Lights in the night, movements beyond comprehension, encounters that turned routine patrols into legends. The Gerald Ford sailors, bound by orders to silence, seldom spoke of the link, yet in their quiet moments, they knew they had become part of the great chain of maritime mystery. Their story fused with the ocean's endless chorus of the unknown. The Atlantic rolled on endlessly, vast and indifferent, its swells carrying the Gerald Ford as easily as they had carried wooden caravels centuries earlier. To those aboard, the sea had always been backdrop, a setting for duty, a stage for drills, a surface to cross on the way to missions. But after that night, many found themselves seeing it differently. The ocean was not empty. It was a vault. Beneath its surface lay depths so immense that even modern instruments could not map them fully. Entire mountain ranges stretched unseen, trenches cut deeper than Everest was tall, pressure crushing beyond what human machines could endure. And in those places of silence and darkness, the unknown had room to hide. When the radar anomalies dropped to sea level and vanished, it was as if the Atlantic itself had swallowed them, folding them into its black waters without trace. For sailors staring out from the catwalks, the thought lingered, perhaps the sea was not just water, but a curtain. Behind it, entire truths might live unseen. Legends had long suggested as much. Ancient stories spoke of civilizations beneath the waves, lost but not gone. Modern folklore spoke of USOs, unidentified submerged objects, darting faster than submarines, glowing faintly before vanishing into impossible depths. Many aboard the Gerald Ford would not use those terms aloud, but they thought them. In their silence, they carried the sense that the ocean had revealed a glimpse, then closed again, as though nothing had happened. The ocean, after all, was a perfect keeper of secrets. It erased traces, swallowed wrecks, silenced machines. Even great ships, once proud and mighty, became only whispers on the seafloor, their stories hidden beneath silt and shadow. If human history could vanish so completely, what chance was there to grasp mysteries never meant for us? For some sailors, the encounter deepened reverence. Standing night watch, they found themselves staring longer at the horizon, listening more carefully to the rhythm of waves. The sea was no longer just obstacle and passage. It was teacher, holding lessons humanity had not yet earned. For others it deepened unease. They lay in their racks with eyes open, thinking of how easily the unknown had slipped between their ships, how quietly it had moved through their airspace, how effortlessly it had vanished into water that covered most of the planet. The officers spoke little of it, their silence sharpened by classification, but even they could not fully escape the weight. Some wondered privately if the encounter had been invitation or warning. Others thought of it as reminder that human mastery of sea and sky was not as complete as charts and maps suggested. The ocean and the heavens were still wild, still capable of humbling even the mightiest ship afloat. As the Gerald Ford continued her patrols, the event was folded into the rhythm of time. New exercises were flown, new ports visited, new missions assigned, but beneath the layers of routine, the memory endured. It surfaced in quiet moments, in long glances cast at the horizon, in the way sailors hesitated before dismissing unusual radar blips. It lived not as open record, but as undercurrent. In the end, the Atlantic held its secret, as it had held countless others. The lights vanished, the logs were locked, the witnesses fell silent, but the truth, whatever it was, remained in the depths, carried in currents, hidden in waves, waiting in skies that would someday perhaps open again. And so, like sailors before them, the crew of the Gerald Ford became part of the sea's great silence. They had glimpsed the unknown, but only briefly, only enough to know it was there. The ocean had given them that, and then taken it back, reminding them that it was keeper not only of wrecks and storms, but of mysteries that stretched far beyond the reach of steel radar or memory. The sea endured, vast and endless, and in its depths, the unknown remained, unbroken, unseen, waiting. The Gerald Ford sailed on, her wake dissolving into the dark Atlantic, her engines thrumming in a steady, unbroken rhythm. Above her stretched the same stars that had guided sailors for millennia, and beneath her rolled the same depths that had hidden mysteries since the beginning of time. What had happened on that night? The lights, the maneuvers, the silence that followed, was carried away, not in headlines or records, but in memory, in whispers, in the private stillness of those who had been there. And now, as we drift gently toward rest, we can step back from the steel and the secrecy, the hum of engines and the weight of orders, and listen instead to what the story really leaves behind: awe. The ocean has always been a place of awe. It humbles, it shelters, it swallows, it gives. For centuries, sailors have stood on its decks, feeling both its power and its quiet patience. They have looked out across black horizons and seen things they could not explain: phantom ships, glowing lights, sudden shadows beneath the waves. They have brought those memories home, retelling them in whispers, passing them down as legends. And each story, whether believed or doubted, has been another thread woven into the fabric of mystery that binds humanity to the sea. The Gerald Ford's crew was no different. They too became part of that long tradition. Their language was the language of radars and maneuvers, of vectors and bearings. Yet at its heart, their story was the same as those of sailors centuries ago: the recognition that the world is vaster, stranger, more beautiful than we can ever fully contain. As you listen, let yourself feel that vastness. Imagine the quiet deck of the carrier at night, the sea stretching in every direction, the stars scattered above like fragments of eternity. The wind moves softly across steel, the waves brush gently against the hull. You are small here, but not insignificant. You are part of a story that began long before you and will continue long after. A story of wonder, of looking upward and outward, of searching the skies and seas for signs of something more. The sailors of the Gerald Ford carried their memories carefully, quietly, hidden beneath classification and silence, but we can let them drift now, like lights across calm water. We can hold them without fear, let them settle into us as reminders of how much mystery the world still holds. Mystery is not always something to solve. Sometimes it is something to rest in, something to soften into, like sinking into the rhythm of the sea. So breathe slowly, as if in time with the ocean itself. Inhale with the gentle rise of the swell, exhale with the soft fall. The ship moves steadily, the horizon calm. All is safe, all is steady, and above you the stars keep their watch. Perhaps the objects were machines, perhaps they were something else, something we do not yet have words for. But in the end it does not matter. What matters is that for a moment, human eyes and human hearts touched the unknown and carried it with them into silence. That is enough. That is always enough. Now let that silence cradle you. Let the hum of the engines become your lullaby, the sweep of radar your heartbeat, the endless ocean your blanket. Feel the weight of secrecy slip away, leaving only calm curiosity, the soft comfort of knowing the world is larger than our fears, richer than our answers. Close your eyes, drift with the carrier across the Atlantic. The sea holds you, the sky covers you, the unknown waits far beyond, but it is gentle now, a distant light, a quiet promise. You are safe here, guided by waves, soothed by stars, carried by mystery into rest. And as sleep comes, let it be like the ocean itself, deep, unbroken, full of hidden wonders. For tomorrow the world will return with its routines, its demands, its noise. But tonight, there is only this, the sea, the sky, and the quiet certainty that mystery itself can be a kind of peace. Rest now, drift now. The story has ended, but the ocean's rhythm continues. Let it carry you where it will, into dreams, into silence, into the endless horizon of sleep.